what is the ego, right? And how is it formed? Okay. It is incarnation that creates the ego. And incarnation is an accelerant for the evolution of consciousness. Okay. It's probably the best way to look at those two things, right? The ego is created through incarnation, and incarnation is simply an accelerant for the evolution of consciousness. Okay. So the ego, how I like to say it, is the fictional character that we create based upon a lack of tangible self-realization, enlightenment. They're really the same thing. The ego is the totality of our misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. That's another way to say it. Okay. The foundation, right, for the ego is the misidentification with the form factor, the body. Okay. Human being is a form factor, right? It's this, right? As opposed to an alien form factor. Okay. So this is the foundation of the ego, is identification with this. Okay. Super important. Because of this deep identification with the body, there's something that happens we could call a contraction of consciousness, right? And we become completely reliant with just the five senses, the five physical senses, right? We've often heard, if I can't see it, smell it, taste it, or whatever, then it doesn't exist, right? Okay. Nothing could be further from the truth than that statement, right? So we start to become completely reliant upon the five senses, right? So we misidentify with the body, and then all we start to use are the five senses that are part of this body, right? Now, the five senses are attuned to the lowest three frequencies within the physical universe. They band together to form sort of one experience. We call this a 3D reality. We call it three-dimensional. It is my experience that it's actually frequencies. We're not actually in the third dimension. We're actually in the first dimension, but we're in the third frequency. Energy exists within frequency, and dimensions are a unit of measure that house frequencies. This is just my experience with that, okay? So as we become misidentified with this body and totally reliant upon very, very, very limited sensory perceptions, right? My understanding is that our five physical senses only perceive literally what I've been instructed to say is 0.003 of what actually exists. Okay, so we're about to form what we call the ego based upon what the five physical senses are able to perceive, which is 0.003. So we can start to understand how inauthentic this human persona really is in comparison to the self, to what we really are, what we eternally are, this changeless, immortal creator being. Okay, so foundation is this body, and now we have five physical senses. Now what we do is, because we are misidentifying with the body and we're not rooted within the self, and again, the ultimate would be, we'll call it self-realization if you like. We're not rooted there. We're rooted with this body and its five senses, right? So we don't know who we are. We don't know why we're here. We don't know how we got here. We don't know what the point is, right? So what do? We create a story based upon misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. And essentially, this will be the information that we are able to perceive with our five senses. And we call these things beliefs, concepts, ideologies, so-called knowledge, right? Okay, so we begin shopping, I'd like to say, shopping for beliefs, shopping for concepts, shopping for ideologies, shopping for so-called knowledge, that we can then reach out and identify ourselves with, right? We see something oh yeah, that's me. I'm going to choose that. And it can be anything. It can be religion. People do this with politics, political parties. They do this with the roles that they play, say for a job. I'm a this and I'm a that, right? So we're identifying ourselves with a small piece of what is. This belief, this ideology, right? This concept, this role, right? Meanwhile, these things are slivers of the totality of what is. Right? If you added all the beliefs, all the concepts, all the ideologies, added them all together, they would not be equivalent to one complete whole self, which is what you are, which is what I am. Right? So we now start shopping for concepts, ideologies, and roles, and then we identify ourselves with these things. You could think of, here's a silly analogy. I like silly analogies. You can think of Spider-Man shooting his spider web and attaching himself to this belief, this role, this ideology. Right? This is kind of what we do energetically, literally. This is what an attachment is. Right? So, quick recap. Foundation is the body, now the five senses. Now we start shopping, and we start creating a character based upon our sensory perceptions. Right? Okay. Now, in order to then process anything, right, it is always in context to our identifications. Right? So, in order to think, there must first be a belief. Every thought is in context to some sort of belief. Okay, this is super important to understand. I want us to deconstruct this formation of the ego and how it operates, right? Because this is probably the single most important understanding that you will ever have. Because the goal of every incarnation is self-realization, right? Which we could say is the transcendence of the ego, or what I call the ego-mind identity. Okay, so our five physical senses are perceiving just a minute amount of information, right? We call these things beliefs, concepts, ideologies, and roles. We then attach ourselves to these things. And then in order to process any information, it is always in relation to the identifications that we have. In fact, we can't process any information unless we've identified with it. We come across something that we say doesn't pertain to us. We don't really understand what's going on with it. We don't take it in at all. There's no processing. There's no understanding whatsoever. It's because there's no identification to it. Okay, makes sense? Right. Okay. So we now have beliefs, concepts, roles, and ideologies that we've identified ourselves with. And again, these things are slivers of the totality of what is. And what you are comes before all of these things. Right? So we're starting to form our character. Right? We're starting to form our human character. And this becomes the way in which we think about ourselves, feel about ourselves, and in turn, how this translates to the outer world and our place in it, or outside of it, for that matter. Okay, so the mind, or what I call the finite mind, right, is the processing of the information that comes in. Right? So there is no sort of higher consciousness going on. We're going to get into that. None of that is going on. This is just sensory perception and the processing of sensory perception. And this is the lower consciousness, or the finite mind. Okay? And we can only process what we identify with. So the processing of information is the mind. Right? And we call that thinking. Okay? So thinking is not knowing, just like believing is not knowing. Knowing is the self. And because we're not anchored to the self, we're left with processing. We are left with thinking. We are left with figuring out. We are left with creating a character instead of knowing ourselves. So what we end up knowing are our beliefs, our concepts, our ideologies, our identifications. Meanwhile, the self goes unexplored, not understood. No real gnosis with a G. Self-knowledge, knowledge of the self. That is missing in this life. And then we continue creating and adding to this character, this human character based upon misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. So this is sort of a very rudimentary understanding of the ego, but it is essentially based upon, it occurs through incarnation, right? Disconnection from the self, right? We then identify with this, and of course the five senses, and then everything the five senses perceives. We pick and choose what it is that we want to identify with, right? This belief, this concept, that concept, this ideology, that ideology. It doesn't really matter. None of them are you. You're more than all of them added together. But then we start picking these things, and then we process information through that set of misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. Beliefs, concepts, and ideologies have nothing to do with what is. They're simply human misunderstandings based upon very limited five senses and identification with the physical form or the body, right? And so we then create the character. We create the ego. Now, for me, it's really an ego-mind identity because they all go together, right? So all your processing, mind activity relates to thinking, and thinking is always in context to a belief, right? And you choose the belief that you identify with. So you can start to see how this is a looped program, right? This is what the ego is. It has nothing to do with the self. The self exists way before all of this. And believe it or not, the self is what's giving birth to this, unfortunately. Right? So you can see how this is a looped program. So I like to say that the ego, I call it the ego mind identity, or the EMI. And if we looked at it from a completely detached perspective, if we were able to go so deep within ourselves, okay, and we could actually see the machinations of the mind, and this is possible to do this, and we can actually see how it functions, we can sort of see sort of the quantum mechanics behind all of that, we would actually start to see that the ego mind identity is a limitation program that runs by thinking. And what has always been the answer to the transcendence of the ego? Meditation, non-thought. What a coincidence. Yeah? So the self is meditation. It's what exists prior to the creation of the ego. And so the challenge is to return to the self when it is most difficult, which is exactly where all of you and me are right now within the lowest frequencies of the physical universe, or what we call 3D, which is really the bottom three frequencies that band into one kind of thing. They give us a 3D experience. Right? So the key is to stop this program, this looped program of limitations that runs by thinking, and return to the self, right? Reside within the self, as the self, for the self, by the self. Right? The incarnation process, I'm going to give a very quick, silly analogy. Okay, most of us have heard that we come from our higher self, the Godhead, the Oversoul. I call it our totality because it's everything we've been, are, and will be. But you can think of the higher self. Okay, so this right here, I know it's my fist, but think of it as an octopus. Okay, right? And think of an octopus dropping down a tentacle or some of its tentacles to see what the water is like a little beneath it. Okay, so we are kind of like that. We're the tentacle, we're the projection, right, of our higher self. That's what a soul or an aspect is. And by the way, it's about 2.5%. What you and I are, about 2.5% of this. Okay, and so this is what gets projected downward. Now, the problem with this is that what we come down is called the Hara line. We've all heard that term, the Hara line, the white tube. This is the tube that people see in near-death experiences. This is also the tube that we come down in. It's the tube that we're going to leave out when we leave this form factor, when we leave this avatar behind, right? Because it's attuned to the lower frequencies. It's part of this lower frequencies. We're not the body. It stays right here, right? Obviously. Okay, so it's this projection downward, and as we are projected downward, right, we come down through this very thin tube. And once we get down here, now I want you to think of a balloon, Well, let's go to another silly analogy. Now, I want you to think of a balloon, and I want you to think of a balloon filled with air and then tied off at the top, knotted at the top, right? We've all seen balloons just kind of floating aimlessly, untethered to anything, and just kind of floating around. Okay, that's you and me. Completely disconnected from the self and disconnected from what we really are and where we come from. That's kind of what happens. And because we're so disconnected from the self, we literally create a character, the ego, mind, identity, with the foundation being the body, then the reliance on the five senses, and then we shop for beliefs, concepts, ideologies, and roles. We attach ourselves to these things. And then any information that comes in is processed based upon our identity. That's how our mind works. And the activity of the mind is thinking based upon our beliefs, concepts, and ideologies, our limitations, these slivers of what is, a sliver of the self. So the true self or the true personality is your higher self. Right? And we cover it up through misperceptions, misunderstandings, and misidentifications. And it's completely understandable because it's very difficult to be here. Just like that balloon who's been tied off and is just kind of floating, untethered, not anchored to the self with a direct connection to the higher self. And so we're left with a human personality, right? Okay, so the key to this, by the way, is to ascend the frequencies, which is why I named my website Ascend the Frequencies. The key is to ascend the frequencies, is to go back up, open up the hairline, allow the information that exists in the frequencies above the human form factor, and allow that to come in, okay? And this increases our communicative abilities with our higher self. This is where we get access to, we could say, boundless amounts of information that cannot be accessed by the five physical senses. This is where past lives and future lives exist. This is the realm of wisdom. Right? And this is the realm of where the Ascend the Frequencies healing technique was created in order to unparalyze myself and reunite with my higher self.